And it's a terrific beginning to the year to have Catherine Holmes coming and talking to us. I'm sure you all know Basil. She's a Byzantinist who's worked a lot on the history of the Byzantine world in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, and produced some remarkable work there. But she's also been very influential and I think very supportive in the global history movement, as it were, in Oxford, which is still thriving despite the terrible death of Mark Whitto and so on. And Catherine has been a major figure in doing this and leading this on and so on. So it's terrific that she's here, at least in image and in voice. It's terrific that she's here in image and voice, and she's going to talk to us this evening. So I think we'll let Catherine give her paper, and then I'll try and manage the chat and other things with help from Alice. But Catherine, you're welcome. The stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm at the right sort of audio level. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and the PowerPoint is largely sort of historiographical, so there's going to be nothing particularly showy about the PowerPoint, but I will make a few references, and if you're interested, then you'll have time, lots of time, in fact, to look at them. Hugh introduced me by saying if it's not one thing, it's another, and that's really going to be the theme of the talk, actually, but you'll see why in a moment. Okay, so share screen. Okay, is that visible?
Yes, that's good. That's good.
That's good, is it? Okay, I think I will just leave it there and then move it along as necessary. Okay, well, there are quite a lot of words in this advertised title.
You might make it full screen, Catherine.
And I'm going to do more justice, I think, to some of them than to others. But I think in my own mind, at least, I do see all the terms I've included as potentially important and inextricably linked. So the idea that I want to explore the most in this talk is networks. So it's the second word, between roughly 900 and 1100. A period which is usually associated, as you know, this very venerable audience will know, with territorial and administrative and cultural expansion, at least for the first 3 quarters, but after 1050 with a marked period of retraction and possibly even collapse of state power. I'm looking at networks because I want to think a little bit more about something else which I've been doing recently, which is thinking about Byzantium as a kinetic empire. I'm going to try and move to the next slide. Yep, there we go. Which is a term that I've borrowed from Pekka Hämäläinen's work on North America, the Comanche Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries. Entrepôt, another word in the title, I think is perhaps a way of thinking about how the network and kinetic parts of the Byzantine experience might fit together. Although rereading what I've put together, I'm not entirely sure that Entrepôt gets the justice it deserves, but we'll see how that goes. Neighbouring worlds, to go back to the title, there are the neighbouring worlds. I'm not really sure that you could talk about this kind of set of concepts without thinking about the world beyond Byzantium. It just doesn't make sense to do that. And I also think it's worth thinking about the world beyond Byzantium, even if the talk will be principally about Byzantium, because many of the neighbouring powers that I'm going to talk about, or neighbouring peoples, were often engaged in quite similar sorts of behaviours. Now, I guess all of the concepts in this title are to some extent drawn from the analytical toolbox. Maybe that's a bit grand, but various tools associated with global history. And what I hope is that these sorts of tools or concepts can help to illuminate some of the processes and resources on which the exercise of power in Byzantium depended. So that's really what I'm interested in doing, is shedding a slightly different light. I'm not sure it's hugely novel, but a slightly different light on the exercise of power in Byzantium by thinking about process and about resource. Using these tools. In the process, I hope that I'll be doing a bit of dismantling of some of the standard temporal and chronological parameters, and I'll be doing a little bit of decentering of Constantinople. And in those senses, I'm hoping that I'll do a little bit of the sort of shifting in geographical perspective and temporal periodization, which global history claims to be some of its goals. But I think what I want to do really is not give you an entirely negative case or an entirely homogenizing case. So I'm going to try and argue that one implication of looking at the Byzantine global through these sorts of lenses is that maybe we can see some familiar things in a rather new way and perhaps become aware of a few important things which could be hiding in plain sight. So actually, I am going to circle back towards the end to talk about the political culture of Constantinople, which in some ways provides quite a lot of compelling evidence, I think, for some of the words in this title, kinetic, network, and entrepot. Now, I thought I would begin by just giving you a few loose, and I have to say somewhat homespun, definitional coordinates for the word network. What do I mean by that? So I suppose I think about networks as being related to the making and sustaining of connections between places and peoples. I think networks are often related to the patterns of constant or at least regular movement and circulation, whether that's of people or goods or ideas. I think of them in connection with the sort of transcending or bypassing or ignoring of borders and boundaries, whether those are real or imaginary. And I think this is perhaps the most important thing which I associate with networks, is that they're to some extent about ongoing process of relationship making in real time. So network is a sort of form of behavior rather than something which is sort of static and mapped. Now, this latter idea, ongoing relationship in real time, I think is important, particularly for Byzantinists, because I think there can be a tendency for us to think about Byzantium in terms of sort of eternal changelessness. Yes, the actual territory the Byzantine state managed might change, but many of the basic coordinates about Byzantine political life, Byzantine political forms can sometimes be assumed to be rather eternal. And I think that kind of eternal model of Byzantium often depends on a very different geometry to Byzantium. It's one which is more about center and periphery, where Constantinople is the dominant center that to a greater or lesser extent draws peoples and goods and ideas inwards and imposes outwards structures that dominate those in the provinces and on the periphery. I think it's a powerful model in Byzantine studies because of some of the scholarship that we have lots of on texts like manuals of statecraft, De Administrando, De Ceremoniis. I will come back to these, so in some ways I'm already tripping myself over. We often, talk about structures in Byzantine political life using artifacts which are generated by the governing structures at the center. One might think of government-sponsored banqueting lists, which give us important information about administration. One might think about Byzantine-led seals. This has no particular significance. I thought I'd just put it up as an illustration. But you can use these lead seals to work out imperial officers both at the center and in the periphery. So it's this kind of centrally produced governing sort of artifacts and texts, which I think often can lead to the notion that there is a sort of eternal Byzantine center. So I suppose one question that will be hovering around this talk is how much can a center periphery model, with which Byzantinists are often happiest, work with one that's more about networks? I mean, in a way, is a network model and a center periphery model just like ships that pass in the night? One is good for some sort of phenomena and the other is good for others, but they're not necessarily so helpful when you combine them. So you could, I guess, say, well, maybe we like the center periphery model for administration. I've just explained why that might be. And in that context, we might think about an inner circle of governance in Constantinople. We might think about a sort of mid-range circle moving out in concentric circles into the provinces and the frontiers. As we move beyond the frontiers, well, what is hardcore governmental structure becomes something more like soft diplomacy, building client peoples, and sometimes reining those client peoples in with more draconian military action. And then beyond that, there's a world of ever softening soft power, like sending mosaicists to decorate the Great Mosque at Cordoba in the middle of the 10th century. You might say that's very different as a kind of set of concentric circles from a network model. Maybe that's good for understanding other kinds of Byzantine phenomena: trade, textual transmission, pilgrimage, monastic foundation, document borrowing, mobile craftsmen. What I want to suggest tonight really is that I think there could be a productive conversation to be had between these two different sorts of approaches to Byzantium, one center periphery and the other a bit more networked and operational in real time. Why am I kind of getting obsessed by this rather abstract idea of Byzantine geometrical approaches to power? I think the background is something that Hugh mentioned earlier, which is that I got involved in a medieval global history project a number of years ago with historians and archaeologists working on different world regions. And that collaborative experience made me, I think, very conscious of some of the kinds of assumptions that Byzantinists bring to the study of our polity, or the polity we work on. And I think they might be assumptions we could question a bit more. For example, Byzantinists often start from the assumption that Byzantium is an empire, has a long-term fixed capital, Constantinople, is a magnet to provincials and more distant outsiders, and that power is about collecting resources into the center and then distributing them out again, particularly mechanisms of taxation which get recycled as salaries. We often assume that there obviously was a long-standing authorized imperial image underpinned by an ideology of Christian rule, which those in the political establishment are invested in. So even if they rebel and express matters of dissent, nonetheless, this sort of model has an eternity to it. But I guess I'm not so sure, and I might be doing my own field down, but I felt when I put this kind of model of Byzantium under the more global spotlight, that maybe as Byzantinists we don't stop enough to think about why political structures exist and the processes that bring them into being, and how are they perpetuated and how are they adapted, if indeed they have these sorts of long-lasting qualities. So we can sometimes fall back on sort of mantras about Byzantium's resilience being the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, the custodian of Orthodox Christianity, the conserver of the culture of ancient Greece. Or we think about very short-term politics and diplomatic machinations of very short-term periods. I think we think a little bit less, though, about ongoing processes by which Byzantium exists and gains, regains, loses sometimes prominence, and who it is that's responsible for that. I think Byzantine studies generally has ascribed a lot of agency to a very small number of high-profile figures when we come to talk about governance and politics, to emperors and their immediate followers. But I think that leaves a lot of important questions, sometimes unasked, about the role of resources, for example, and about the reciprocity of power in the construction of power, the reciprocity of relationships in that construction of power. So to sort of cut a rather meandering story short, I think by taking Byzantium into a more global environment, I began to think more about politics as process and about the tangible and intangible resources that are involved in political relationship making. And it began to dawn on me that maybe those of us that have worked on Byzantine politics from the Constantinopolitan center should think a little bit more about how that center engages actively and continuously with networks that circulate the goods and the peoples, the ideas that might serve that sort of central power's needs. And maybe we should be alert a little bit more than I think we have been to the possibility that endeavor to work with networks was not always terribly successful. Now, I'm not going to claim I'm the first Byzantinist ever to think about networks. That would be very foolish. A lot of work has been done on the socio-political networks of the Byzantine capital and provinces and frontiers by some very eminent Byzantinists in recent years, using a variety of source materials, including the lead seals, which I just showed an example of earlier. So people like Jean-Claude Chenet and Margaret Mullett on her work, using her work on letters. I don't think I'm also alone in wanting to think about the relationship between networks and center periphery dynamics, or thinking about how Byzantium actually functioned in real time. A lot of the work of Johannes Preiser Capella is very invested in this kind of research. As far as the 10th and 11th centuries goes, there's some very interesting research by Johannes Parlich on networks that connect Melkite communities, Chalcedonian communities that operate in Arabic in Syria and Egypt, to the Byzantines. Similarly, Tim Greenwood has been doing a lot of work on Armenian clerics and intellectuals, and the sometimes competing networks interaction with an expanding Byzantine state in the 11th century. Now, of course, one could argue, in the case of some of the work of Parlich and Greenwood, that while studies about Melkite networks, Armenian networks, throw interesting light on social and religious and cultural networks, they're still operating from the base assumption that ultimate power and authority lies with the Byzantine center. So the networks they're working on in some ways are responding to that Constantinopolitan center, rather than either sustaining or challenging that center. I mean, that might not be a surprising conclusion, because the work of Parlich and Greenwood, in this sense, is often focusing on networks during a period of Byzantine military expansion. As I said at the beginning of the talk, most of the period I'm dealing with tonight is a period of expansion in which the reach of Constantinople into the peripheries is usually seen as very strong, with a centralized state drawing in taxes from a strong economy, payment being enforced through legislation, and the old theme armies, the old provincial militias, being replaced by a full-time mercenary field army with frontier garrisons. All of that accompanied, I mean, this would be a traditional story, with a very shrill imperial rhetoric. So you may remember Nicephorus Phocas, emperor of the 10th century, telling Liutprand of Cremona that Otto I is just going to be smashed up like a piece of pottery if he interferes anymore in the affairs of southern Italy. Even a relatively armchair emperor like Constantine Porphyrogenitus is staging ceremonial in Constantinople, which involves the trampling of the necks of Byzantium's captured enemies. So, you know, the general picture about the 10th and the 11th centuries is this is a time when centralized imperial power is expanding. If we were interested in thinking about the role of networks in either challenging or making imperial power dependent on those networks, you know, to be honest, the early 10th century to the mid 11th century doesn't look like the best place to look. Better, surely, would be to look at a slightly later period, the later 11th century, when the empire began to suffer external military defeat and internal political conflict. And in that sense, I'd point you in the direction, if you're interested in networks in Byzantium, serious publications on how they work in a time of Byzantine collapse. I'd point you towards Alexander Byhammer's study of local and regional networks in Eastern Anatolia and the way in which the gradual transition from Byzantine power to Seljuk power works. One could also think about the work of Jonathan Shepherd and Peter Frankopan in thinking about how Alexius Comnenus, towards the end of the 11th century, is reaching out to very distant networks to try and persuade people to come and fight for the Byzantines and shore up imperial authority, most obviously during the period of the First Crusade. I don't really want to go against any of this research. I think what I want to suggest today, though, is that the Byzantine emperor's engagement with networks of different sorts perhaps exhibits some continuities across the period of expansion and the period of retraction, which were which mean that regional and transregional networks were perhaps not significant to political processes just at the moment when the empire begins to collapse, but are actually have an importance across this whole 2-century period. So yes, what I want to do is to think a little bit more about continuities. And if we think about continuities, does that challenge in some ways the idea of Byzantium strengthening across most of our period and then sort of falling off a cliff at the end? So I'm going to take 2 different tacks. I hope I can squeeze it all into half an hour. The first tack is to go back actually to the reign of Basil II, a period which is regarded, generally speaking, so here is dear old Basil, later known as the Bulgar Slayer. So Basil, spanning the later 10th and early 11th centuries, often regarded as a high point for the medieval empire and associated with military expansion and consolidation. And yet what I want to say is that maybe once we look at it through a network lens, we begin to see a slightly different picture. In the second and shorter phase of the talk, I'm going to be a bit more speculative and introduce a few embryonic thoughts about a debate that I think we might be able to see in some late 11th century Byzantine texts about what kinds of networks were likely to be the most effective in sustaining and preserving imperial power. And that's going to take me back to Constantinople. So to start off with, Basil II, a networked approach. Well, Basil II's reign, and I'm sure many of you know this, is often interpreted in 2 phases. The first, a relatively well-evidenced period, which lasts for 13 years, from 976 to 989, usually seen as a time of great internal stress, as the emperor finds himself threatened by 2 major rebellions led by 2 very experienced generals, confusingly called the same name, Bardas Scleros, Bardas Phocas. After 989, the second, much longer but very obscure phase of the reign is usually seen as a period of attritional warfare against the Bulgarians. In 1018, Bulgaria is conquered, and then there's a final few years of conspicuous campaigning in the east, and some plans which got quite well advanced to invade Sicily. Now, Basil II's reign is something that I looked at in a lot of detail a number of years ago, and I did so mainly in terms of centre periphery, thinking about how did Constantinople extend its governance into the peripheries and the frontiers. So in going back to Basil very briefly tonight, I think it's interesting to look through the other end of this telescope and to think about the reign in a more network kind of way. Not just about the different kinds of networks that were visible in Basil's reign, but how easy was it for the emperor and his followers to enlist and direct network power to their own advantage? Is it just the case that the emperors held all the cards and networks fell into line when they were compelled to do so? Or is there a different story to be told? Does that kind of perspective cut the emperor down to a size that we might not necessarily always recognize? Well, I'm not going to do full justice to this, but I'm just going to give you some preliminary thoughts about 1 or 2 different sorts of networks. I'm largely going to skip over a network which, if I go back to do this seriously, I would want to find out more about, and that is the network of officials and families within the imperial court whose service to the empire is conducted in the provinces as bureaucrats or as military commanders, and above all, the network of associates of Basil II's uncle, also confusingly called Basil, which was an extremely powerful nexus of individuals that dominated really the second half of the 10th century, and about which I think more could be said. But I'm going to park that for now. Another kind of network which I think one could do more with includes regional elites, particularly those that span the frontiers, groups like the Armenians, the Arabs, the Kurdish military commanders in the east, those who join up with some of the rebellions against Basil, particularly the revolt of Bardas Scleros. Other Easterners from Georgia especially often support the rebel Bardas Phocas. Basil II himself draws on those on or beyond the periphery when he calls for Rus troops from Kiev to help him in his most desperate hour of need in the civil wars. Those are very well known collaborations. There are some smaller scale networks that get drawn into the civil wars of the first half of Basil's reign. Now, this is an absolutely terrible map, but towards the center and towards the bottom of the map, you'll see a little place called Aparank, which is south of Lake Van. The reason just for highlighting this is we know from Armenian sources about an individual called Zapronik, who was a sort of middle-ranking Byzantine commander from this location, who fought both for Bardas Scleros and for Basil II. And in reward, eventually, for going over to Basil, he gets some relics from Constantinople, which get put into his church in Aparank, which only ever comes into the direct Byzantine orbit relatively late. So he's very definitely part of a trans-frontier network world. In some ways, you could say, well, isn't the fact that Basil II and his brother Constantine sending relics to this individual out on the frontier quite a kind of center-periphery relationship in which the cards seem to lie with the center? But Hugh mentioned Mark Whitto at the start of the talk. Almost everything that Mark ever wrote had some kind of sort of element of genius about it. And in his book, The Making of Orthodox Byzantium, he does make some throwaway comments about the significance of these kinds of frontier networks to the civil wars in Basil II's reign, and the degree to which these individuals and the connections between them often proved essential to the eventual outcomes in Constantinople. Because the lands of some of the individuals and some of the families involved in this politics of the late 10th century eventually get absorbed into the Byzantine Empire, and because many of the families in those networks eventually get new Byzantine titles and get sent elsewhere in the empire, I think we sometimes underestimate their significance and see them as somewhat peripheral, somewhat sort of disposable clients. And you know, basically the power still lies with Constantinople. But I think this is to overlook, well, the thing I was talking about earlier, the sort of processes involved in bringing these networks into Byzantine politics, and then seeing how the Byzantine politics of the time gets filtered through them. And I think it overlooks the very considerable efforts that the Byzantine center often had to make in order to make networks of this sort out in the frontiers subordinate and pliable. I'll just say briefly what I mean by that, about efforts to manage networks at the frontier. Well, clearly one method of management at times could be that of violence. And we know that Basil II, particularly in the second half of his reign, organized and personally led at least 3 large campaigns to the east, which combine very aggressive punitive measures, together with some soft power doling out of titles and prestige gifts. A year or so ago, I was working a bit more on this idea of kinetic empire, from which I imported from Pekka Heimalainen. And I did think it was quite useful for thinking about some of these long distance campaigns, long distance raids, which emperors, and Basil is not the only one, lead in frontier regions. How is that useful? Well, a distant imperial power, Constantinople in the sense, suddenly appears without warning, makes itself visible, conducts raiding, is interested in taking booty and prisoners, and leaves a lot of physical marks of its empire on those that it encounters. Most obviously, in the Byzantine case in Basil's reign, we think of that episode in which he blinds a large number of Bulgarians. How many it was, and you know what kind of phenomenon that was, one can question. But undoubtedly, physical mutilation during the process of raiding was something that we see on other frontiers, including in Basil's campaigns, both against northern Syria and in this more eastern region, which I've been pointing to just now. But I mean, I'm still quite interested in the kinetic approach, but I think we need also to recognize that these raids were relatively infrequent, probably for two reasons. One is that Basil couldn't be everywhere at once. So if you lead one big raid into the east, that means you're going to have to leave the western frontiers alone. It's very expensive to conduct raiding on all fronts, but also because constant raiding could probably be rather counterproductive. So launching assaults could persuade people, if you went with the right sorts of titles and the right sorts of silks and other goodies to hand out and relics, you know, could persuade people into your following, but it could also be quite repelling. And I suppose one can think of moments of failure for the Byzantine central state on the frontier. In the De Administrando, that manual of client management, so it's usually seen produced by Constantine Porphyrogenitus, there are two very interesting episodes. One takes place around the city of Ardanuțin, which is at the top and center of the map that I've put on the screen, or Ardanuț, which is a Georgian city. This is where Entrepôts makes a surprise appearance, about to disappear in a moment again. Ardanuțin is an entrepôt, it's a trading center, and it's very clear from the De Administrando the Byzantines wanted to get hold of it, but they didn't have enough leverage in that region, and they are basically forced to leave. A bit less total was what happened at the city of Theodosiopolis, which is a little bit further south and west of Ardanuț, which is modern-day Erzurum. Again, the De Administrando tells us in the late 940s, Theodosiopolis does eventually fall to the Byzantines, but only after quite a long period where the local Georgians refused to cooperate in some form of joint action. So I think what such episodes suggest is that even in its military heyday in the 10th and early 11th century, Byzantine management of the frontier was not always a foregone conclusion. It required soft as well as hard power, and it wasn't always destined to succeed. Now, I said Entrepôts made a surprise and brief appearance. I want to just say a little bit more about commerce and places of exchange in talking about sort of the third type of network, which I think one could relate to the general picture that I'm describing, and the third kind of network from the period of Basil II. So in other words, what about trading and commercial networks? Those sorts of things that we're often aware of as a kind of background noise, but which I think might be more profitably foregrounded. And I've come to think that in the light of the work that scholars like Thomas Olsen and Elizabeth Endicott have done in kind of unpacking the relationship between imperial power and commercial and cultural exchange in the Mongol world, and also the kind of focus that Hämäläinen's Kinetic Empire approach devotes to commerce and exchange. So I guess the questions, if one were thinking about how to relate commercial networks to imperial power, would be things like, how far and hard did imperial authorities have to work to provide the infrastructure for trade? How much can they bend traders towards their own ends? How much do trading networks, how willing are they to be bent or forced to be bent, and how much do they sort of move away? How influential are they in governance? I mean, it appeals to me, the notion that commercial networks should be important for power, but maybe they weren't. I'm going to offer you three quick examples for why we might want to take them seriously. The first one comes from, where are we? From just before Basil's reign. So a treaty which is drawn up between the Byzantines and the city of Aleppo, shortly after the Byzantines conquered or reconquered the city of Antioch. So it's the very end of the reign of Nicephorus Phocas. The way we normally treat this treaty is in terms of an increasingly asymmetric relationship between an aggressive 10th century Byzantium and a rather weaker Aleppan emirate governed by the Hamdanids, who were sort of frontier warlords operating under the very remote aegis of the Caliph in Baghdad. So we'd normally see, I think, this treaty in terms of the development of a client relationship between a powerful Byzantium and a much weaker neighbour. But something which doesn't get talked about so much, I think, is that there is an important commercial dimension to this treaty. There are a large number of clauses which relate to caravans, which carry gold, silver, silk, stones, linen, brocade. Now, one is tempted, of course, to think that those clauses belong to a different sort of commercial world, which is not really desperately connected to politics, or maybe at most it's just the sign of a sort of tributary relationship. But I think it would be unwise to separate out the world of power building and commercial activity, because in fact, one of those rebellions I referred to earlier, the Scleros revolt, the text we have for that revolt demonstrate that both the network of Scleros, a big frontier general, and Basil II, they're both trying to get hold of that caravan as it crosses the Taurus Mountains. There are references to this in the testimony of Scleros, which I'll come back to later. So presumably the wealth of this kind of commercial set of exchanges is considered very important in the maintaining and building of alliances in quite a fragile local political ecology. The second example I'm just going to mention briefly is that more squarely from the reign of Basil II, which is a treaty that's drawn up with Venice, in which the imperial authorities were willing to offer Venetians quite substantial tariff reductions on trade to Constantinople, which passes through a place called Abydos, which is located at the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. So this is a relationship which deepens over the next 2 decades as the Byzantines give the Venetians more titles, they give them marriage arrangements, particularly to the family of the Doge. Relics are sent to Venice. And by 1000, so 8 years later, the Doge is sailing up and down the Adriatic, calling himself the Dux of Dalmatia. So all of that suggests that the Byzantines needed something from Venice, maybe naval assistance for their wars against the Bulgarians, possibly because the Bulgarians or the Fatimids in Egypt may have been sort of diverting Venetian trade. Maybe the Byzantines were actually having to work harder to persuade the Venetians that they were, the Venetians were their representatives in Italy. This is the period, after all, of the growth of Ottonian power. But whatever the answer, and I think it's very difficult to know what the answer might be, more than 15 years into his adult reign, after all of the civil wars of the early part of his reign are over, Basil II's relationship with the networks of Venice still looks like something like a work in progress, rather than a kind of one-sided assertion of centralized imperial power. Now, the third example I think is really interesting, but I realized when I went back and looked at my IHR lecture or seminar of about 6 years ago, I have talked about before. So I thought I probably ought not to do that again. But the last example, it comes from the end of Basil's reign. If one is interested in how does imperial power intersect with commercial networks, an episode which happens almost in the last campaigning that Basil II ever does, in Melitene, is extremely interesting. So in essence, a group of Miaphysite Christians from Melitene, a commercial hub, which is on, I think it's on the map here, yes, towards the left-hand side of that map. Some Miaphysite Christians from that commercial hub basically bankroll Basil II and his army through a desperately cold winter when Basil comes back from campaigning yet further east. Now, you could say, well, the reason why these Eastern Christians in Melitene were prepared to bankroll them was because an emperor with a very large army turned up on their doorstep, and I guess you would. But I'm not sure that the relationship between the emperors and these Eastern Christians was necessarily quite so asymmetric. So in other words, it is likely that some of the Eastern Christians in Melitene, some of them are connected to the Armenian world. The ones in question here were connected to a Syrian Christian network of merchants, which extended well outside Byzantine controlled areas down into Crete and other cities on the Tigris River. And those merchants and their families had been encouraged to come and settle in Melitene by Nicephorus Phocas a number of decades earlier to help revive the commercial interests of the city. So at the very least, this is a trans-regional commercial network, and it's one that Basil II in his hour of need needed to plug into in order to be able to sustain his army in the east. So I think it's a very interesting episode. I would be open to the idea that I'm being too kind of generous in my interpretation that these Takritan merchants and Melitene merchants had some power on their side, but I think they certainly, it wasn't an entirely one-way street. So to just sum up these brief sort of network examples from the reign of Basil II, I guess what I'm saying is we need to be careful when we start to think about some of these relationships about how far we press the idea of an expansionary later 10th and early 11th century empire. Yes, there are a lot of military conquests on a number of different frontiers with a better financed and organized army. And we have, after all, got evidence, seals, banqueting lists, and so on, which demonstrate an intensification of some official presence across the empire, including in the frontiers. But looking at networks demonstrates, I think, how contingent and frail that imperial power could be, even when backed with great military strength. Violence is involved certainly in the sort of management of relationships, particularly in these frontier worlds. But I think we misconstrue those relationships if we think about them only in terms of kind of easy polarities, carrot and stick, or easy geographies like center and periphery, or easy temporalities like expansion and then only retraction much later. So I think those kinds of binaries imply a sort of solid imperial time and space, which was never that certain for all of the rhetoric that we get from the imperial center, whether it's in texts like the De Administrando or the De Ceremoniis, or whether it's in the ceremonial that was enacted out in places like the Hippodrome in Constantinople or in entrances through the Golden Gate. What I said I'd do at the very end of this talk is move to the later 11th century and also move back to Constantinople. So what I want to do in the final few moments is argue that although some of the written texts produced by the Constantinopolitan elite in both the 10th and 11th centuries don't necessarily, are full of rhetoric, I'm not sure that they necessarily completely distort the day-to-day negotiated nature of power, and that sometimes they can shed valuable light on the continuities that we see across both centuries in the creation of power. Now, the notion that sort of networked behavior has a lot of continuity across the 10th and 11th centuries, and we can see that in Constantinopolitan produced sources, would probably not be a great surprise. I won't go back to the slide, but earlier on, I put up the name of Jean-Claude Chenet. Chenet's work over the last 4 decades has been to really mine many of the histories produced in Constantinople and look at the prosopographical detail from seals and just demonstrate the way in which all sorts of socio-political networks, particularly those associated with aristocrats, the kind of very similar roles that they played in coups and the acquisition of power and the diminution of power across both centuries. What's very consistent, if you look at Chenet's work and his use of these materials to talk about networks, is just how consistent the strategies and motives were of these aristocratic groups. They operate within different temporal contexts, but they're often working and creating power in very, very similar sorts of ways. So I'm not going to talk so much about those sorts of socio-political networks in the center of Byzantium, I want to talk perhaps about a different set of networks, which Constantinopolitan elite sources, I think, do suggest were consistently integral to the operation of political relationships in the later period as well as in the earlier period. And those networks involve actors that we usually see as outsiders to the empire or somehow as unassimilated or foreign. And that's partly because our sources often call them that. You know, they don't tell you that these are really integrated, at least superficially, these are really integrated people. But actually, the deeper one goes, one perhaps realizes that they actually are, and they're recognized as such by the Constantinopolitan elite. Now, these thoughts are extremely embryonic, and I realize I'm going to have to run through them quite quickly. So please stick with me, and if they're too confusing, then I hope to clear things up in any questions. So what I really have in mind here is looking at Constantinopolitan texts like histories, like letters, like handbooks, and thinking about imperial interactions with groups that we might want to call insider, outsider, so Franks, Armenians, Georgians, Rus, and a variety of steppe nomads. And it's the steppe nomads that I'm going to be particularly interested in, particularly the Pechenegs, who are steppe nomads who appear in the surviving sources of the 10th century to be living on the steppes north of the Black Sea. And by the 11th century, they are more prominent in our sources north of the Danube, or on the left bank of the Danube, at which point they seem to begin to raid and migrate more directly into Byzantium on the other side of the Danube. And those raids come from the reign of Basil's brother onwards and intensify, particularly in the reign of Constantine Monomachus and beyond. And you may remember that Alexius Comnenus has to deal with the Pechenegs in the 1090s. Now, one way to make sense of the Pechenegs' relationship with Byzantium is to argue that over the arc of the 10th and 11th centuries, they transformed from being a useful ally north of the Black Sea, and they were useful for threatening people like the Rus when they're too problematic, or the Bulgarians. And you could look at things like the letters of the Patriarch Nicholas Mysticus to see these kinds of relationships working, and you can look in great detail at them in different bits of the De Administrando Imperio. You could, using Constantinopolitan sources, suggest that there is a marked deterioration in the relationship between the Pechenegs and the Byzantines when you read the testimony of the Constantinopolitan historian John Scalitzes, whose name is on the screen. And it's from Scalitzes' account that we hear about the multiple invasions in the mid to late 11th century across the Danube, particularly in the reign of Constantine IX. And the material is really quite detailed. And Scalitzes tells us a lot about what he regards, or what his sources regard, as fundamental misjudgments which the emperor and his associates made in managing their diplomatic relationships with the nomads. Particularly an apparently disastrous assumption that these mobile horsemen could be absorbed within the empire and turned into tax-paying farmers. Now, it's clear that the notion of Pecheneg aggression towards Byzantium in the 11th century isn't entirely a figment of a fevered Constantinopolitan imagination on the part of Scalitzes. So there's an interesting book that's come out relatively recently by Paron on the Pechenegs, and he has some very interesting material on the changing geopolitical order beyond Byzantium, north of the Black Sea, in the steppes, which involves the expansion of Rus power. It involves the movement of steppe nomads east of the Pechenegs, groups called the Uzis. And in that sort of realignment, the Pechenegs were being pushed further westwards and do appear to have migrated into Byzantine territory over the Danube in ways which were unprecedented. But while the geopolitics of the frontiers of Byzantium were, I think, undoubtedly changing because of this extra beyond Byzantium set of transitions over the 10th and 11th centuries, so I don't want to argue that nothing changed. If you read Scalitzes, there are some quite interesting elements of continuity particularly from a Byzantine perspective, with the 10th century sources, particularly in how it is the Byzantines thought about the creation of bonds between imperial authority and groupings within the Pecheneг polity. So in common with the De Administrando, Scalitsi's history includes a sort of summary account of the who's who of the Pechenegs and a potted history of the political elite. So both in the 10th and the 11th centuries, the Byzantines are thinking about the Pechenegs in terms of, we need to know who these people are. And you could argue the reason for that is because the Byzantines thought this was the way, consistently thought this was the way in which you could manage and exploit that elite. So just as that's sort of what the De Administrando tells the Byzantines to do if they want to use the Pechenegs and other steppe nomads, Scalitsi's narrative account includes divide and rule principles. He explains how the Byzantines exploited divisions between a kind of newcomer figure in Pecheneg world called Kegen and a more prestigious figure called Tirak. But I think what's interesting about Scalitsi's account is the way in which this was not just one-way client management style exploitation. In many senses, he sort of suggests that the Byzantines and the territories they claimed to govern were just as much, if not more, the object of exploitation by the Pechenegs. And Parron's book has a very interesting allusion to the fact that we need to be incredibly careful as Byzantinists and as historians of sedentary peoples that we don't just see steppe nomads as puppets who jump up and down sort of jerkily whenever centralized sedentary states choose to use them, and the rest of the time they have no particular political interests of their own. As individuals, as communities, they have interests, they conduct embassies, they have their own expectations of responsible diplomatic behavior. So one of the interesting bits of Scalitsi's account is it's the Pechenegs who are often disappointed by the Byzantines. If you've read the De Administrando on the Pechenegs, you'll know that the reader is led to believe that steppe nomads will always disappoint the Byzantines. The coin is flipped the other way around in Scalitsi's account. So in coming towards the end, I'd recommend, if you're interested in sedentary people's steppe nomad relations, I would recommend Scalitsi's coverage anyway, particularly of the reign of Constantine IX, Constantine Monomachus. I'd also recommend reading the reigns of the later 11th century emperors. And on the slide, I've given you the details because there's not just a good translation of Scalitsi's himself, which helps a lot with reading the core text. There's also a Greek-facing translation of Scalitsi's Continuatus, which has come out very recently. So the degree of detail in his narrative, particularly the Scalitsi's narrative, I think allows us to see some of the long-term continuities of imperial engagement with a variety of networks that are vital to governance, particularly at a military level within Byzantium. And not just the Pechenegs, but he has information also on how the Seljuk Turks, other steppe nomads like the Uzis, other insider outsiders are drawn into Byzantium. For those of you who've got interests in how the Franks end up in Byzantium, there's quite a lot of material there. Not the detail of the Pecheneg example, but still interesting material. So yeah, key recommendation, read Scalitsi's coverage. Jonathan Shepherd, who I mentioned earlier, and I forgot to put this on the slide, has wrote an article back in the 1970s, which talks about the remarkable degree of detail that Scalitsi's affords to the Pecheneg moment. But my final point really relates to what I think is a wrinkle in Scalitsi's text, and it's a wrinkle in the kind of long-term continuities of frontier network management, which I've been stressing this evening. But I think it is an interesting wrinkle, which is that those in the center of Byzantium, I don't think always agreed about how networks should be managed, encouraged, punished, but instead they were the subject to debate. I mean, this may not be surprising, but I just found it intriguing when I suddenly saw it happening. So at one level, we see a debate among the Byzantines themselves in Scalitsi's account of the mid-11th century Pecheneg wars. So there's a moment when a senior Byzantine general is sent from Constantinople to try and turn the Pechenegs around. And he refuses the advice that he's given by somebody called Katakalon Kekavmenos, who is a provincial commander who has a lot of experience in managing nomads. Scalitzes makes it clear that Kekavmenos' advice was based on his long-term exposure to working in this frontier region with the nomads, a region which, by the way, pop-up moment for Entrepôts, is full of places of exchange, commercial exchange between the local population nomads and the Byzantines. So Kekavmenos, who's probably the source that Scalitzes is using, thinks he knows how to deal with nomads, and he thinks that those from the Constantinopolitan center that he's having to deal with probably don't. But I think you can go a bit further than just saying Scalitzes comments on debates that happened in mid-11th century and later 11th century Byzantium. I think you could suggest that Scalitzes himself is a contributor to those sorts of arguments about how to manage networks. And these are debates which were still rumbling at the time when Scalitzes compiled his chronicle, which was in probably the 1090s, many decades after the events which he's describing. And here you just have to follow the logic of a question. Why did Scalitzes, who's principally a derivative historian, so he's principally creating a synopsis, a kind of squashed down, simplified account of the Byzantine past, why does he include quite so much detailed material on the Pecheneg invasions? I mean, they're significant, but they're not necessarily as significant as some of the other things which he could be writing about at length, and yet they're given enormous amounts of coverage. Why, in the continuation to the narrative, probably also written by Scalitzes, does he add in other information about other nomad contingents, particularly some more mysterious group called the Uzis? And he adds that material into the sources he uses for his later 11th century history. So he basically, in the continuation, he riffs on a much more detailed historian called Michael Attaliates. But there are particular moments where he adds in additional information about the fact that the Byzantines used steppe nomads as affiliate troops. So does Scalitzes, or did Scalitzes, have his own point to make? And is he making a case in the very turbulent decades at the beginning of the reign of Alexius Comnenus about the kind of frontier networks that he thought would be most useful to the Byzantines? If he is making a case, is he making a case against somebody else? It would be very tempting to think he could be making a case against Michael Psellos, who himself considered himself to be a military strategist. So Psellos, a kind of all-round polymath. Scalitzes, in the continuation, is very hostile to Psellos. He's very rude about him. So perhaps there is some sort of strategic debate about how you manage networks and how you use them and which the best ones are, which surface in some of these Constantinopolitan texts. Now, much of this is very speculative, but I want to just suggest, as I come to my last paragraph, you may be relieved to know that for those who were close to the emperor and for the emperor himself, engage, or herself on rare occasions, engaging with networks was essential to the construction and survival of power. Engagements with networks were always ongoing processes in time, and I think they're processes which sort of defy making periodizations which are too crude. And so if I'm arguing for anything, it's flattening out some of the Byzantium on an up and then Byzantium on a down. I think there's a great deal of more continuity. How best to network is a process, though, which I think is subject to constant and ongoing debate. And I guess that's the thing which I will want to sort of pursue a bit further now that I think that's something that I've identified. And if you want to make a claim as a Byzantine writer in this kind of debate, well, looking to the past and meditating on it could clearly be very useful. And in that context, it is perhaps interesting to note that the version of the De Administrande, which most of us read as a 10th century text, and I'm not going to dispute that it is a 10th century text, we only have the De Administrande because it survives in an 11th century copy, which is made at roughly this time in which Scalitzes is writing, so at the end of the 11th century. So I think there is something that's going on in the later 11th century, looking back over the previous 200 years to think about how do we manage our neighbours and networks. So I'll stop there.